3 months since I made my mouse enclosure Bioactive. I was going to wait until 6 months to give you an update and give you my thoughts, but I don't think it's going to be here in another 3 months time. So this is just my experience, and obviously it's just that. It's just my personal experience. Other people could have an entirely different one and different results, but I wanted to share everything I did and how I feel about it now, because going into this I've always been quite skeptical that a bioactive could work for mice, but I really wanted to try this, and I feel like all of the pretty pictures online and some of the research I did didn't really talk about some of the difficulties and the things that can go wrong, and I would hate for anyone to watch that original video or just see my pictures of this online and think that it worked, because it didn't. So I suppose I better start with the pros, otherwise this video is going to be entirely biased and entirely negative. There are some positives to having a bioactive enclosure. The list is a lot smaller than the list of negatives I got, so we will start with the pros. I'm still glad that I did this, otherwise I would have been sat here wondering, could I make this work? Could it be good? I would have always had that in my mind to try this. So I'm glad that I did try it, because there has been a few positives. I guess the first one is that it did look nice initially, and it does look nice when you've just freshened it up and added in fresh hay and herbs and sprays. This doesn't last very long. It does go back to being quite barren and ugly pretty quickly, but when it's looking nice, it is quite nice. I like the natural look to this. I much prefer the look of this compared to just bedding. I think it looks really nice all tied together, so I guess that is the first pro. The next pro is the mice did make some really nice tunnels. It did take them a couple of months to actually make any that I could see. They made a really good one kind of at this side against the glass, which unfortunately I did have to disturb to turn the soil, which was a shame, but they have made a few really nice tunnels and it's been really fun watching them go back and forth. Not as many as I expected them to make. They haven't been digging as much as they would in loose bedding, but the tunnels have been really nice to see. It does hold a lot better, so watching them express their natural behaviours has been a huge plus. The cleanup crew in this enclosure in the soil also seem to be doing really well. I did get a few concerns and comments that they wouldn't survive or the mice would just eat them all, and there's still a healthy population of springtails, isopods, and even the earthworms. I still sometimes see them moving at the front of the glass. I did also find one that had been bitten in half by a mouse the other day, but they're all still in there, surprisingly doing okay. You do of course have to add more in over time because they are going to start to diminish, but they haven't been entirely eliminated. And that's where the pros end. All of the positives that I did expect, like it being more time efficient, cost effective, a lot less wasteful, healthier for the mice, ended up being negatives. So to go through all the struggles I've had with this, it's probably easier to go along a timeline, and I'd say about a month or just over a month in is when things started to fall apart. This is when I'd usually do a big deep clean on my mouse enclosure, take out all the bedding, clean everything and put it back in, and that's when things started to show. So I was following all of the recommendations and advice on bioactive Facebook groups. Mostly these are for rat bioactives, where the difference I guess between rats and mice is that rats can be trained to use a litter tray. Mice can if you want to, but it is a lot trickier, so none of mine are litter trained. I don't think I know anyone who has got mice that are litter trained, and that means they're pretty much just going in some select spots, but also just everywhere. So I think the difference between rat bioactives and mouse bioactives is rat bioactives still very much rely on the rats using a litter tray and not putting all of their load of waste directly into the soil. So I was following all of the advice on these groups in the files and the posts, but I was having to do these things a lot more often than people tended to say you had to do. I was turning the soil quite regularly, adding water back in. I was having to spray the surface of the soil quite a fair bit every single day, because overnight during the day it does dry out pretty quickly and it was just dry on the surface. So having to do things a lot more often than it seemed that other people were saying you had to. So about a month or so in, it started to smell, and not just like a natural earthy bioactive smell, it was very much a smell of ammonia. And a lot of advice online when it comes to mammal bioactives is that it will eventually work itself out, the nitrogen cycle will kick in and it won't smell as much. But this made me very, very nervous, so I was dumping a lot of BioBoost into the soil just to try to combat that smell, and it would kind of temporarily help if I was dumping this in areas that it mostly smelt where they were obviously peeing in certain spots of the soil, but it was only really a temporary fix. So it's all good and well, some of the advice online being to just push through and come out the other end where it's all settled and balanced. But at what detriment? I feel like it's not healthy for animals. I know it's not healthy for animals that have such sensitive respiratory systems to be sat in these conditions just waiting and hoping that it's going to sort itself out. I didn't really personally feel comfortable waiting any longer than it already had to have them living in conditions that didn't smell great. Obviously that is going to start to have an effect on them, and that was really starting to worry me. It was around about then that one of my mice developed an eye infection, and this could be a complete coincidence. It could have been something that was going to happen regardless of what bedding she was on, but even with medication and eye drops twice a day, daily, it has taken a long time for this eye infection to go away, and it's starting to make me question if maybe there is a connection between the bedding and the mouse having an eye infection, because some mice and rats are just sensitive to certain beddings. You can have a certain bedding, a shaving type bedding or aspen or hemp that works with your rats and mice for years and years, and then just have one that tends to be quite sensitive to that. So I do think having a bioactive soil is also the same in that regard, where some mice maybe are quite sensitive to this, and I'm not sure if there has been a connection with her having the eye infection and the soil being bioactive. So at this point I was really struggling, and this was only like 2 months in. It felt very premature and like I wasn't really giving it much of a chance, but I just wanted to quit and give up. The smell was bothering me whenever I came into the room, so no doubt it was also bothering the mice, even the rats as well. So all I wanted to do in that moment was just pull the mice out, put them back into a normal setup with normal bedding, and just be done with it. So I asked for help. I reached out first to a few people I knew that had tried Bioactive with their mice, and they told me that they had given up with this a long time ago and no longer had a Bioactive enclosure, which was not reassuring. Then I made a post about this and I got some really good responses, basically just saying that a mouse enclosure cannot ever be fully bioactive, and you are going to have to do occasional soil changes just to remove all of that ammonia and the nitrogen in the soil, because there's no plants in a mouse enclosure that would otherwise do this. Which makes complete sense if you've ever learned about the nitrogen cycle. It's why you do water changes in a fish tank. But why did I not think of this, and why didn't it come up in my research when I was planning this enclosure? So it kind of defeats the whole point and the whole appeal of doing a bioactive in the first place, to have a semi-self-sufficient ecosystem that doesn't need regular bedding changes, but it does. I felt quite annoyed at myself, honestly, and annoyed at the research that I had done, that this hadn't come up anywhere as something that I would have to do. And I do think the term bioactive for mammals, at least, not my harvest mice are doing completely fine in their bioactive, but I think mammals that produce a lot of waste and ammonia, the term bioactive and the use of that instead of semi-bioactive is quite misleading. It is a lot of work. You're having to make sure the soil is kept damp, the soil has been turned, and the soil is not getting mouldy or anything, and also making sure the cleanup crew are okay, they've got things they need, they're being topped up and replaced when needed, which will be fine. All of this will be fine, but then you're also having to do soil changes on a regular basis that you'd have to do anyway with normal bedding. So it's not making things any easier. If anything, it's making your life a lot more work. So whilst I was trying to decide what to do and if I wanted to continue with this or not, I did go ahead and buy more soil and also some more cleanup crew just to replace this. Basically just to say that I've tried everything. So I removed and replaced 50% of the soil, and this was a job in itself. It is still sat outside on the landing because it is so heavy. I can't physically carry this down the stairs, but it also begs another question of what do you do with it? You're technically not supposed to release isopods, springtails, other cleanup crew outside into the wild because most of them are not a native species, and if you've ever bought isopods or live food, it is very clearly displayed on the packaging, so you can't really just dump the soil outside. I'd imagine also just putting this into the bin is also a bit of a grey area, so what is the ideal solution to this? Also, long term, throwing away live creatures every month or so just doesn't sit right with me, and I certainly don't have the time to sit there and sift through and pick them out. It would also be impossible to find every single baby isopod or any of the springtails because they're so small. So I did try to make this work. I changed half the soil once. I also put in some new springtails and isopods just to keep those topped up. Of course, I was still pouring all of the bio boost in this, just hoping for the best. But pretty much as soon as I did this, I knew that it wasn't really something that I had any intentions of continuing. As someone that does have chronic illnesses, I try to make my life as easy as possible, and for some animals that has been making their enclosures bioactive. Definitely for the reptiles that has helped, and for other animals like the rats, giving them a deep layer of bedding to do monthly cleans instead of weekly cleans definitely helps. But this is just too much. It's too much to be hauling soil out of the enclosure, up and down the stairs. It's just a lot. Doing that 50% soil change has really helped with the smell, but I know that it's just gonna come back. I need doing again in a month's time, 2 months' time, and I'm just over it. There is also a few other negatives that are worth mentioning, although I've not really seen too many signs of mould because the cleanup crew have done a really good job, specifically the springtails, on keeping that down. The soil is not the kindest to the wooden items in there. They have got a bit damp and wet and just kind of, they're not looking very good, and they are going to need replacing probably at some point, so that is another negative. So that's that. Shortly after filming this, I'm going to switch all of this bedding out back to regular bedding, and I think it's just going to be much better for everyone involved. Me, the mice, but most importantly for the health of the mice going forward, because I've just been on edge this entire time that it's going to have detrimental effects on them if I left it any longer. It has had me wondering though, although this enclosure is perfectly fine for the 5 mice, it's 100 by 60 centimetres, maybe when it comes to bioactive, those minimums go out the window and you need a much bigger expanse and much more mass of soil to handle all of that bio load and all of that waste produced by the mice. I'm thinking that might be the case. Maybe there's just too many mice in this enclosure, which usually would be fine. I've never noticed a smell with them, even when they're coming up or needing a deep clean. There's not really a smell in this enclosure, but maybe when it comes to something like a bioactive, you do have to have a much larger enclosure to have more soil. That is something that I've considered could also be the issue. Maybe it might work okay if you just had 3 mice living in this as a bioactive, but considering we also have 2 other mice that are living separately until one of mine passes away, there is no chance I would ever consider putting them into this too, when it can't even handle the mice I have in there at the moment. But overall, I'm still glad that I gave this a go. I was considering this for a while, and I think it's one of those things where you don't really know until you've tried something. But would I have done this if I'd known that it wouldn't be fully bioactive? Probably not. But I'm interested to hear what you think and your experiences if you've tried bioactive with your mice or other mammals in the comments. Please be nice. I'm sure there's things you think I've done wrong or I could have done differently. But by this point it's probably too late. I've probably already put this back to how it was before because I can't risk the health of my mice. So here is one last look of it being a bioactive before I switch it back to regular bedding. Right now it looks really nice. I love the way it looks when it's all done up and I've just added in hay and sprays. But pretty quickly, in a couple of days, when all of this is broken down or eaten, it doesn't look this cute. So I will miss the way it looks, but not the way it smells. Right now it's not too bad, but yeah, here is one final look of this before I switch it back to being normal bedding, shaving type bedding, as a Bioactive. So I just thought I would also quickly answer any questions you've got about me having a Bioactive with the mice, just in case I missed anything or forgot to mention something, which is quite a high possibility. So the first question is, would you recommend going Bioactive? Now I can only really speak on my experience with this. I would recommend everyone to try something if they're really curious about whether it works or not. Other people probably have success with this that I haven't had, so by all means try this if you really want to, but I would be less inclined to recommend this now that I have tried it. This is a really good question, and it says, how does it work with intros? Do you have to change it, or do you leave the cleanup crew to refresh it? So this was also a concern of mine that I've not had to come across yet. I got very close to having to do intros whilst having a Bioactive, and obviously when it comes to introducing mice and rats, you want things to be as neutral as possible, and obviously the soil is still going to smell like the old mice, so I don't have the perfect answer for this. I guess you could try to use the same soil, but otherwise you might have to replace this just to make it neutral, which again would be a bit of a nightmare. But if you're having to change the soil anyway, as I found, then I would probably just change the whole thing. Do plants actually live long enough to grow in there? No. So when I first started, I did plant some seeds and things to grow like grass and plants. But when it comes to actually using live plants in a mouse enclosure, it's very, very tricky. Some mice you might get lucky and they don't destroy them within like a day or two. Some people do put in things like spider plants, but I just didn't bother because I knew my mice would shred these and destroy them. So that makes the entire issue of not having plants in a Bioactive, because mice will and do shred and destroy. They'll destroy the roots of plants and it's just a mess. Have you found that the tunnels are more supported than with the bedding? Yes, I'd say so. I'd say they hold pretty well, especially when you've got the right kind of moisture in the soil. And I guess that's one of the downsides of me not doing this anymore. They were making some really good tunnels, and I've never really found the perfect bedding combination to get those kind of tunnels. So I'm going to be trying my best, but I guess that's one of the things I am going to miss, is seeing them make some really cute tunnels. What would you do differently if you were to do this over again? Besides not doing it at all, no. I would probably not use cocoa fibre or cocoa soil. Initially I did 1 bag of that, and then also 1 bag of topsoil, and then when I top this up I just used topsoil because I found the cocoa soil, when that got dug to the surface, that was what dried out super quick. So probably just using topsoil only. I would probably just do that instead. Have you had any issues with fungus gnats? No, thankfully, although that was my biggest fear when doing this, because when I've just done a simple dig box with the mice and the rats before, come summer that does attract things like fruit flies, fungus gnats, and they are a nightmare to get rid of. You pretty much just have to dump and get rid of the soil, so no, but I probably would have come summer. Did you get any kind of mould on anything wooden? I think I mentioned this previously briefly, but I did get a small amount of mould on like the front of the hides where they kind of meet the glass in the gap, but that went away pretty quickly. The springtails did a really good job of keeping that down, and after the first month or so there hasn't been any signs of mould, which is good. It kind of proves the cleanup crew are doing their job, at least where mould is concerned. Not with anything else, but the mould was kept very low, which is good because otherwise I probably would have had a breakdown about that too. Okay, last question. I'm pretty sure I answered most of the questions I got in like the bulk of the video, but this one says, how much does it cost long term compared to traditional bedding? I've tried to work this out and I do think it does actually cost more because you are having to replace the soil, and that was going to be one of the benefits that I thought would make it a lot more cost effective. But because you are having to buy that soil, I think I paid £10 for that bag of topsoil the other day, which is only half of this soil in the enclosure. So £20-ish total for the soil in all of this. And the regular bedding I use with my rats and my mice, I pay £12 for a big bale. and I'd use maybe a third of that to fill this entire enclosure, so it definitely does work out more expensive. You've also got to buy more cleanup crew. They're about £3 per tub each, and you need like 2 tubs of springtails, a tub of isopods, things like that. Also buying the Bio Boost, you need to top that up, so I think it does work out more expensive than just a normal enclosure. But that is it for this video. We are waving bye bye to the Bioactive. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!